Grace, mercy, and peace are yours from God our Father through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Our sermon text again comes from Luke in chapter 9. We read verses 28 through 36. Will you please rise for the reading of the gospel? Now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory, the two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. Please bow your heads with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So this Sunday is Transfiguration Sunday, and it marks a transition in the church year. In the section just prior to this, we have the season of Epiphany, which focuses on the revelation of Jesus Christ. In particular, the revelation of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, which began with the coming of the 3 wise men. And then after Transfiguration Sunday, then we're going to have the season of Lent, in which we focus upon the suffering and the death of Jesus Christ, having its culmination on Good Friday. And this is a time of transition within the church year, but what we find going on within our text was also a time of transition for Jesus himself. Jesus' public ministry was about to take a bit of a turn. See, just prior to this, Jesus had had what's normally referred to as his years of popularity, where his teachings were well accepted, and many of his most famous miracles done for the greatest amount of people were accomplished, including the feeding of the 5,000. And it's then through this process, and through his miracles and his early ministry, that he begins to draw his disciples to him. They begin to know him more fully. In the section just prior to our text, then, we have the section of Peter's great confession to Jesus. Right? Peter says to Jesus, You are the Christ. After Jesus asks them, Who do people say that I am? The disciples had come to the understanding of who Jesus was. That he wasn't John the Baptist, that he wasn't a prophet, that he wasn't a man like any other man that had ever walked upon this earth. He was the Messiah, the chosen one of God. And you can imagine this must have been very exciting for the disciples at this point in time, right? They were part of God's chosen people. They had been awaiting the Messiah for literally thousands of years. The promise was made back to Eve in the Garden of Eden, the one who would come who would crush the serpent's head, the first prophecy of the Messiah, the first gospel that was ever proclaimed. And after that, through the preaching to Abraham, it was made known that through his seed, all the nations would be blessed. And then it was promised to David that one would come and sit on his throne. And then Moses made the prophecy that one would come after him, who would be another great prophet, and they should listen to him. And so here he is, Jesus, the Messiah, he's here. And these disciples, they had the joy of knowing that he was there in their lifetime. And not only that, but they had been chosen to be his 12 disciples. Must have been a wonderful, marvelous time for the disciples. And the realization of who Jesus was, that Jesus was the Messiah. But this is when the ministry of Jesus takes a turn. Because it's immediately after Peter makes his great confession as to who Jesus is. Jesus goes on to explain to them his first prophecy from his own mouth, considering his death. Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed. So this is what the Messiah came to do. That was a hard pill for the disciples to swallow. Peter even took Jesus aside and attempted to rebuke him, saying, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And as we know, then Jesus responds to Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Because Jesus understood that this is exactly what the Messiah had to do. He had to suffer. He had to die. But then, before Jesus begins his journey to Jerusalem, which would begin with Palm Sunday and end with his crucifixion on the cross, we have this transfiguration. And what did it tell the disciples? Well, clearly it was a very impactful situation. Our text begins now about 8 days after these sayings. He took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. Jesus took aside 3 of his disciples that would be essential in the establishment of the New Testament church. And he shows them this great vision of his glory, his true glory. And it stuck with them throughout their lives. Peter wrote about it in his second letter, in his second epistle. Peter writes, "We were eyewitnesses of his majesty, for when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, 'This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased.' We ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain." And John writes at the very beginning of his gospel, "We have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So what was it about this transfiguration that was so important to these disciples that they would mention it numerous times in the writings, that would stick with them so vividly? Well, I suppose there's many things that the Transfiguration tells us. There's many things we can learn from it, but today we're going to focus on 3 things. 3 things that the Transfiguration communicated to the disciples on that day, and that communicates to us as well. The first will be the focus on who it was that appeared with Jesus and what that meant. The second aspect that we'll focus on is the difference between the 2 mountains. The mountain on which Jesus reveals his glory, and then the Mount Sinai, in which Moses also has similar parallels to this text. And then the third, and most important factor from this text, and what we can draw out of it, and what God is communicating, is that Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be. So the first aspect, who it was that appeared with Jesus on that mountain. In verse 30 and 31 it goes, "And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem." And so what this is communicating then to the disciples and communicating to us is Moses and Elijah. They represent the 2 essential factors of the Old Testament. Elijah, the prophet, the prophecy that's found in the Old Testament, and then Moses, the giver of the law. And with these 2 men then appearing on the holy mountain alongside Jesus is a confirmation that Jesus is the fulfillment of those 2 things. Jesus is the fulfillment of all that Moses gave, being the law. And that Jesus also is the fulfillment of all prophecy, as figured here in the prophet Elijah. It's a stamp of approval from God that everything that took place in the Old Testament is being fulfilled right here and right now in their presence with Jesus Christ. And God thunders down from heaven, saying, "This is my Son, my chosen one, listen to him." He has all the authority of the prophets, all the authority of Moses, and he is the fulfillment of both those things, the law and the prophets. That's the first thing that the Transfiguration communicates to us. And the second thing that we draw out from this text is the parallels between our Old Testament reading, right, in which Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and then the Transfiguration of Jesus on this holy mountain. Peter makes it clear that this is the holy mountain. Mount Sinai is also referred to as the holy mountain of God. And they have these parallels, right? Moses came down from the mountain. What was his face doing? It was shining. Jesus on this mountain, his face also is shining. His appearance is radiant, dazzling white, like snow. But there's two very different things that take place. When Moses comes down from the holy mountain, what does he have to do? He has to put a veil over his face. The people can't even bear to look at him. What does that tell us? Well, oftentimes people have this idea in their head that it'd be so nice to be with God. It'd be so nice to be in the presence of God. And they leave Jesus out of the equation. You find this in much of contemporary theology and contemporary music, how nice it would be just to be in the presence of God. However, what does the Old Testament tell us about being in the presence of the almighty, holy, holy God? Well, it's not going to go so well for you if you go in on your own accord. What happened to Isaiah when he was taken up in his vision into heaven? He appeared before the 3 times holy God. He said, "Woe is me! I'm a man of unclean lips. I am undone." And what happened if someone was to step into the Holy of Holies in the temple of God? They'd be struck down. Only the high priest could go in there only one time a year, and only after completing many sacrifices and rituals. There was a curtain that was set up so that people couldn't even see into the temple of God. It was a communication that we, of ourselves, through the law given on Mount Sinai, have no way we can stand in the presence of God. The people couldn't even bear to look at the face of Moses. It had to be veiled. And so it is with us. If we attempt to come before God by our own merits, by our own good works, through our own goodness, we have no right to do so. No right to come before a holy God. Excuse me, I just want to make sure nothing's catching on fire. But what happens when Jesus is transfigured? Peter and James and John say, this is good. It's good for us to be here. That fear isn't there. They're with their master. They're with their Savior. Right? The same Savior who said to them, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The same Savior who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus came to be the go-between between God and man. And while they trembled at the appearance of Jesus, they still recognized him as their Savior. They didn't turn away. They didn't turn away. There's two great parallels, or two great differences between these two mountains. And then the third thing that we learned from the Transfiguration, and the most important thing, is a confirmation of who Jesus is. Jesus revealed himself for this brief moment in time in his glory. Who he really was. The Son of God, with all his power and all his might. And this would be especially important for the disciples in the time that was to come. It's important for us to remember in the season of Lent and the readings that we have coming up. Because what Jesus goes through doesn't much appear like he does in our text right now. The Lord of glory, the Son of God. He enters into Jerusalem on a lowly donkey. And then this Lord of glory allows himself to be falsely accused and condemned. And this Lord of glory then allows himself to be beaten and whipped. He allows a crown of thorns to be put on his head and beaten into him. This Lord of glory allows himself to go upon the cross, be nailed to it, suffer, and die. But what the Transfiguration tells us, and that all these things that are about to happen, he still retains that same power. He He still is the Lord of glory that he reveals here. But he laid all that aside. He set aside his power. He set aside everything that he could have done. He could have called down legions of angels to be at his side, but he doesn't do so. Instead, he willingly submits to all that. And that's where we find the Lord of glory in his love for us. And that is why we are children of God. It's because of what Christ has done for us. It's why we can call upon him despite how sinful we know we are. We can call upon God the Father as our dear Heavenly Father. And it is because of what that Lord of glory did. He took all of our sin, all of our shortcomings, everything that makes us unable to come into his presence. He takes that sin upon himself and he suffers for it. And then that glory that he has, he gives it to us. That perfect life that he lived is accredited to us. And that division that existed between the temple and the people, what happened at Jesus' death? It was torn right down the middle, communicating to us that the separation between God and man due to our uncleanness no longer exists. Jesus took that sin upon himself, and we are forgiven in Christ. So brothers and sisters in Christ, that is what the Transfiguration communicates to us. To Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, be the glory, now and forever.